Welcome everyone to this second session of the Doing Ecological Economics seminar, an official seminar of the International Society for Ecological Economics. So the aim of this webinar series is to share experiences with academic and non-academic practitioners of ecological economics in order to improve the reach, the scope, and the societal relevance of ecological economics. So if you have any ideas of topics you think would be relevant to discuss in that seminar, you're very welcome to send us a suggestion, and we'll be happy to organize a seminar about it. So today is the second session. There will be other session to come, so stay tuned. Probably the next one will happen in more or less 1 month. So today the topic that we will be discussing together is ecological economics in business and climate policy decision-making. And we have two panel members with us today. Philipp Cenkowsky, who is a researcher and consultant with the Perspective Climate Group, and who will be soon a PhD student at the University of Lausanne. And Philipp is also a member of the Think 7 Task Force on Climate and the Environment. And our second guest is Victor Cannilla, who is a former trader and management consultant, as well as a former international environmental policy analyst. Victor is currently a student in the online master's degree in political ecology and degrowth at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and will also be soon a PhD student in political science on geopolitics and degrowth, also at the University of Lausanne. So Philipp and Victor, thank you very much to both of you for accepting to be with us here today. So just to start the conversation, first, everyone who is watching this seminar now, please feel free to ask your question in the chat. This event is meant to be a discussion, and I'll be happy to relay your questions to Philipp and Victor. My name is Louison Cahen-Fourot. I am an assistant professor in economics at the Department of Social Science and Business at Roskilde University in Denmark. I will be facilitating this seminar. And I also would like to thank Roldan Mouradian, who is the president of the International Society for Ecological Economics and who acts as a technical support in the background. So just to start, could you briefly tell us about your experience working with ecological economics and or environmental issues in decision making? Philipp, do you want to start?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Louison, and it's a pleasure to be here in this great webinar series. So maybe just briefly on myself and Perspectives Climate Group. So Perspectives Climate Group, it's a research and consultancy company in the field of international climate policy. We work with the public and the private sector on diverse mitigation and adaptation strategies globally, and since the company exists since more than 2 decades. And my work specifically at Perspectives is on the one hand on nationally determined contributions, so NDCs. I've worked specifically on Ethiopia and Morocco, and just for those who don't know, NDCs are the climate strategies that in the bottom-up regime of the Paris Agreement are submitted to the UNFCCC. Then I also work on topics related to international climate finance, specifically the negotiations, and I'm an observer of, and I was also a delegate to the negotiations on climate finance at the COP26 in Glasgow. And last but not least, my currently biggest project is actually on the alignment of financial flows with the Paris Agreement. And at Perspectives, we have a research program on working on export credit agencies. And the focus there is on the global energy transition and basically on shifting finance from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and shifting financial support for these technologies in export sectors in industrialized countries. And so happy to receive any questions or discuss these issues with you. And just briefly on my background on ecological economics, so I've just studied about that in depth at the university in the bachelor in Heidelberg under Professor Malte Faber, who is a German ecological economist. And then I've been involved in the network for pluralist economics for more than 6 years. And I did a heterodox master's, the epoch master economic policies in the age of globalization in Paris and Johannesburg, and have also research experience at the PIC, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. And yeah, just briefly, where I'm in touch with, let's say, insights from ecological economics is the idea of absolute limits. And this is, let's say, one argument that we are increasingly using to persuade governments on the one hand, but then also public finance institutions to recognize that the shift of finance of public finance flows out of fossil fuel value chains and into value chains in renewable energy technology sectors is really necessary and crucial. And that's what we work on together with a research and NGO community at the international level. And maybe just so briefly on that, and with that, back to you, Louison.
Thank you, Philipp. Victor, would you like to tell us about your own experience?
With pleasure. Thanks, Louison. Hi, everyone. So my name is Victor Cannilla. I live in Switzerland, in Lausanne. My academic background is physics and then finance. So I'm more of in terms of economics background, I'm more of a really mainstream, we could say, neoclassical theory. I then worked as a trader in trading derivatives products, mostly on interest rates, government interest rates. I started to see, I'm now 29, so that was 7 years ago. I quickly started to doubt a bit of the axioms that I had been taught in my master in finance and financial math, and started to get interested in other paradigms in economic thought, notably ecological economics, but also back in the days, and degrowth with the paradigms developed by Serge Latouche, Yorgos Kallis, and thinkers of the like. I wanted to do consultancy to figure out a bit more precisely what I would do, and I entered Boston Consulting Group, the global management consulting firm, and I tried to specialize on public sector clients. So over there, as a practitioner, consultant for environmental policy, I did 1 year at a large NGO, WWF, specializing on African participation in international treaties. So our focus was basically, as WWF, to go to the national ministers and to help them scale up their ambitions, either in the NDCs for the COP26, like Philipp was mentioning, but also in their contribution for the COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity. I also was involved at WWF during the start of the COVID crisis. So there was a lot of discussions within the ministries and within the UN agencies that were part of that environment, or within the NGOs that were systemic NGOs that were part of that environment. There were the question of how do we put ecology and environmental policy at the heart of national interests during a time of a sanitary crisis and a financial and economic crisis, where notably African countries were getting very high amounts of debt, as much as in the global north, but those are different economic structures. So there was the debate of how do we manage to still get some political space or political momentum or political willingness, as we could say, as kind of euphemism in policy, to have some ambitious targets and agreements in the CBD and in the UNFCCC. And then after that, I also, before leaving BCG, after 3 years of work, I also worked in different UN agencies, notably the WHO, which has nothing to do with ecology per se, or very little. But let's say that the institutional framework and the interaction between private sector, national governments, UN agencies, other international agencies, and large NGOs has similar constraints as what we see in environmental policy. So we were facing some similar structural problems when trying to bring, let's say, heterodox ideas like what is in ecological economics. So yeah, as Louison said, now I'm back in more academic fields.
Thank you, Victor. I will elaborate more on all of this. Just as a first very simple question, maybe, but based on your own experience, do you think that NGOs, politicians, or businesses are familiar, generally speaking, with ecological economics? Who wants to start on this? Victor?
I can start, yeah, with pleasure. Let me be very brief and then develop. No, absolutely not, sadly. I think you have a little portion of people within policy circles who have economics degrees, which means very often not ecological economics, but other more mainstream frameworks to bring in some, let's say, some theoretical frameworks into the political discussions. But most often than not, actually, people within business or political circles don't have an economics training at all. But yeah, when they do, it's mostly let's say, classic free market arguments, classic market as a neutral institution type of backgrounds, these axioms are very rarely put on the table. So, for example, if someone comes in such a discussion, or even just between colleagues in an NGO or in a consultancy, speaking about degrowth, I think the higher up in the hierarchy, the more weird you will sound by bringing on those topics.
Yeah, maybe let me add to that. I can echo principally what you said. So ecological economics is, well, in my experience, also often confounded with environmental economics, and well, most people in policy circles, also as NGO circles at the international climate policy level, they don't necessarily know about the differences between environmental economics and ecological economics, even from those that have a background in economics. But I was personally very happy to see that the International Society of Ecological Economics was also having some dedicated side events at the COP, to which of them I have attended, and I think that is really a good way to bringing this thought to this level.
Thank you. So just before we move on with the next questions, just a reminder to everyone who is watching now that you are very welcome to write your questions and remark in the chat, and we can relay them to Victor and Philipp to fuel the discussion. So a question that immediately follows up from what you said is, as practitioner with background in ecological economics and political ecology, how is your discourse received by the stakeholders you deal with, or you have dealt with in various contexts? Victor?
Let me bring concrete cases, because otherwise it's just posturing. But for example, if we speak about finance, so what could be the role of financial institution within ecological transformation or energy transitions? If we get a framework like the SBTI or this type of voluntary framework for corporations and financial institutions to report on certain willing targets, that's already within big NGOs and official, let's say, high-level environmental policy makers. That's already a big victory in the current environment. So just willing targets and so on, just by putting many countries on the same page with what kind of framework to use, is already concerned by like a victory. So if someone with a bit more of interest for getting a bit more theoretical or a bit beyond just voluntary framework or usual discussions about carbon taxes, will come and say, yeah, but this is a half victory because we can go much further. The usual question will be, so what's the alternative? Isn't that a utopia? Isn't that something that's out of textbooks or out of ecological thinking, economics thinking, but nothing to do with the real practical and pragmatic world? So the first question will always be, so what do you propose instead? So if you come up with ideas like, nationalized banks or local banks which are democratically ruled to have a bit more citizen intervention of where the capital gets allocated, or if you go by saying we need to restrict banks or certain corporation instead of putting labels and voluntary reporting, to put very, very top-down measures and regulation, it will always come up as this is utopia, this doesn't work, this is not efficient. So the usual dogma. Something that I read recently was the a bit like the Godwin point. You have the Stalin point. So if you go too far into let's say something that can be perceived as derived from left-wing ideas or Marxian economics or radical ecology, then people will always say this will end up in the gulag. So that's very cliche, but it's actually answers that I would always get. And really, those are things that you very quickly learn not to say in official meetings, because this put people in very uncomfortable positions. So you will keep it for the coffee machine or stuff like that. But the higher up you go in the hierarchy, so for example, if I speak with someone who's also like me between 25 and 35, maybe they will be receptive of hearing about whatever worker cooperatives instead of big multinational corporations that are private. So in the younger age classes that can be okay, but if you go to your N+1 or N+2 and tell the director of economic policy that we need to go further because the situation is urgent and we're doing half measures, you will be in trouble just by mentioning it in one-to-one. And I'm not even talking about mentioning it in front of clients or in front of high-level policymakers, unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe let me come in here. I think that's quite true what you say, but it also depends on the term that is being used. So, you know, the notion. I think with degrowth, this is indeed quite problematic, especially the higher up you go. But with other notions that I would say, you know, can be attributed maybe to, you know, the School of Ecological Economics, you know, such as absolute limits to the production of fossil fuels or the absorptive capacity of the Earth before, you know, reaching a tipping point or so. This is increasingly, you know, an accepted scientific fact, and it's not something that also high-level decision makers can easily ward off by saying, you know, well, that would be, you know, too much of a radical claim. So I think with let's say some of the insights from ecological economics that are maybe more radical, what in my view and also in some of my colleagues, what works quite well if you wrap the same ideas into a more, let's say, acceptable term and then just present them. This is kind of a Trojan horse strategy. And that in my experience works quite well. And then, you know, as time passes, then you know, potentially also the terms can change. And yeah, just one last thing on how, let's say, this discourse is received now concretely on the work that I'm doing on public finance institutions that are still quite heavily invested in fossil fuels or support them through other instruments like guarantees or insurance schemes, which is something that export credit agencies typically do to de-risk foreign investment or trade, which is a state agency, right? It's kind of the state that then would back up certain transactions in, you know, in the energy sector, in large scale infrastructure, etc. pp. And what is basically what is perceived as a response to our arguments is often fear of losing jobs domestically. So imagine a country that exports a lot of equipment in the fossil fuel value chain, right? So drilling equipment, dredging equipment, you know, other high technologies that are needed to, you know, for the various stages of the fossil fuel value chain. So this is, you know, exploration, extraction, processing, transport, final use. There's a whole bunch of economic subsectors that need very specific equipment that is mostly produced in advanced industrialized economies, for instance, the Netherlands, the UK, Germany. So even though we have maybe ambitious climate targets, we still export these types of technologies. And when we basically argued that at least the state should not support this type of export anymore, then so what we normally hear back is, well, this leads to job losses, or that this leads to other countries that would jump in and take that market niche and thereby gain a disproportionate economic benefit, like for instance, China would just sell the same equipment to this country X that has a demand for that. So, and then for us concretely, what that means is basically doing analysis, doing studies, finding arguments, empirically backed up arguments that this would not be the case, and that actually shifting from fossil fuel value chains with the right policies in place to supporting an emerging pipeline of more clean energy technologies, renewable energies, would actually lead to job increases rather than to job losses. And this this needs proper modelization and data and so forth. But then with a certain line of arguments, then you can, let's say, quite robustly counteract the arguments that we're getting, and convince a policymaker that wants to see some evidence that would mitigate his or her fear.
Victor, you want to react to that?
Yeah, thanks. No, I strongly echo what Philipp just said. I think it's also important to distinguish environmental policy on the international level and at the national level. I think within the national level, you have more space for discussions getting into a bit different directions and different contexts, especially within the ministries of environment. Classically, there you can be a bit more open-minded. Now, there is the big issue that always comes on the table of the conflicts between ministries. So often, if you manage to get someone just below the Minister of Environment to agree on your proposition to be a bit stricter on some frameworks of national accounting or of corporate externalities accounting, for example, you can get that within the Ministry of Environment, but then you will have the Ministry of Agriculture, which is often very much against free markets and very much against, let's say, neoclassical heterodoxy, because they are often very big provider of state subsidies to their national agricultural interests, who will come in and say this is counter of our national interests. So you will get conflicts between, for example, typically the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Environment. So then you also have those battles. And on the international level, as Philipp said, then you always have the arguments of what is the other doing, what is China doing, and so on. I think, Philipp, you started your argument by saying something that I very much agree with, is that words matter a lot. So which kind of rhetoric you will use is very crucial to make some ideas pass in policy making. So, for example, if you go starting with two theoretical frameworks of ecological economics, you might not get successful discussions. But if you bring on the table some frameworks that are getting increasingly accepted, like donut economics or the Stockholm framework for the planetary boundaries, then you might get into meaningful directions. So it's very much a battle on words, but it also happened in the wrong side, if I may say, because, for example, natural capital in every biodiversity discussion was really used as a Trojan horse to make some regulation pass that would enable, for example, derivative products on some pieces of forests, or privatization of some lands that used to be common lands of the Congo Basin, for example. So think tanks such as the World Economic Forum, who will do a very high campaign on making natural capital mainstream, will also use the battle on words to pass some of their ideas. So it's often very tricky, and not so much on the academic, purely intellectual level, but also on the political battles on which interest and which wording you will try to use to make policy pass.
But just staying a bit on this, talking about words, for instance, I read in a Swiss newspaper, Victor, that before you left the Boston Consulting Group, you gave a presentation to your colleague about degrowth and the social ecological transformation. How was this received by your colleague from BCG?
Yeah, thanks. That's I think people within BCG and very big corporations are under high influence of the think tanks that I mentioned before. The World Economic Forum is a prime partner of BCG, for example. And if you look at BCG think tanks or at McKinsey think tanks, you really have almost word by word the same as what the World Economic Forum is saying, or what you would expect from large institutions of the like. In my case, in my presentation to BCG, my colleagues being so used to the kind of rhetoric of what can finance do to help, or innovation will save us, or technology will save us, when someone comes with a speech that's more linked to degrowth wording, or how do we get here, or putting on the table words such as capitalism, which frankly are taboo in those kind of circles, or even profits is a taboo word. You speak about creating value, you don't say creating profits for shareholders. So when you come and you use strong words, or maybe not strong words, but unusual words in those circles, people were actually very, very positively reacting, especially, as I mentioned earlier, in the younger age classes, because this breaks with the usual omnipresent greenwashing. So actually a very high amount of support. When I gave this first presentation to my BCG colleagues, maybe 200 plus people, in the Zoom chat, there were more than 30 messages of support in public, which is that was an earthquake on BCG level, because you never get this type of participation in the Zoom chat and so on. So then this created a second webinar in which I could go a bit more depth into political theory and let's say heterodox ideas. Obviously, the higher up in the hierarchy, the greater the dislike for this kind of ideas. So this was really, I would almost say, a micro example of class struggles, because you really had people higher up in the hierarchy who were perfectly understanding that what I was doing indirectly was against the official rhetoric of BCG, and against or let's say could lead to people doubting what BCG is producing as political line and the business line. So that's kind of inside trouble, and often employers don't like that, obviously.
Thanks, Victor. That's very interesting. We have a question in the chat from Kaylee asking whether you've already discussed about the Jevons paradox with some stakeholders, and whether that's a good term to use in this kind of interactions.
I can take that. Yeah, well, I haven't explained the Jevons paradox so far, but I would say the main insight from that certainly, which is the rebound effect, right? So I know it from the context of British coal use. Well, once you had steam engines that could use coal, then the whole production went up, although the efficiency was a lot higher. So I mean, we see the same in for instance for vehicles, right? The more efficient an internal combustion engine gets, that doesn't mean that overall we have a smaller amount of fuel use. To the contrary, there are studies that show that exactly that, and in 20 years of gaining efficiency actually led to an increased amount of kilometers driven by more efficient cars. The same is for electric vehicles and so forth. So I think this is a really great term actually to bring up, because there are so many empirical examples with which to back it up, and so many fields of application that it is really a key term.
But Victor?
Yeah, no, I strongly agree. I think the strength of the Jevons paradox, whether you call it that way or the rebound effect, is that first it comes from economics, so it carries a bit more credibility within policy circles and within business circles. And to be honest, policy circles are kind of blended with business circles nowadays. So you have a lot of people with this mindset. So it carries this credibility. As Philipp said, you have tons of empirical examples. I think it's important not only to speak about combustion engines and very much documented cases, but also to try to bring it on to current situation. Things like what happens with whatever with Uberization, or with lighter cars, or with more efficient engine even nowadays, with renovation for thermic efficiency in housing. Those are all cases that are very interesting. For example, Germany putting tons of money into the thermic insulation, but then people warming up stronger because they have more budget on their gas bill. Those are really good entry points. Kaylee, I recommend you put the discussion not on a ideological level, but you put it within economics thought, and you put it in a direction that's very much usable with practical examples. So that's really a great opener. Now, what I would love to see is more think tanks and more publications, or more academic publications on these types of topics, and on how it applies today, and how to try to solve this paradox.
There are quite some literature on how to tackle the issue of the Jevons paradox, but we could also say that private corporations have an interest in this kind of dynamics, because increasing environmental efficiency leading to increasing sales can also increase profit, of course. And that leads me to a next question, which would be like whether the stakeholders that you've been dealing with, how they approach the issue of the social ecological transformation. Do they approach it at all, and do they develop like their an own understanding of it? Like what is their own view about this issue? Okay.
Yeah, just briefly on that. So from a UNFCCC context at the COPs, I would say the topic of it is a comprehensive social ecological transformation is normally not discussed as such, because it's too broad of a concept. It would involve too broad an array of topics, and there's really like a strong focus on CO2 emissions or CO2 equivalents and their reduction in targets, which in many cases falls short of what's actually needed. One example, for instance, right, is the application of or the desirability of green hydrogen and its rollout as a new energy carrier. If you only look at CO2 emission savings compared to fossil fuels that could potentially be replaced, there is a strong case for it. But if you look from a systems perspective of the infrastructure requirements that you need for it, the additional rare materials for the electrolyzers to produce green hydrogen, and also the efficiency losses that's probably even the strongest argument compared to using the electricity directly, then that opens up so many more arguments that only looking at emissions is really too little. But this is often something that unfortunately is lost, I would argue, in a bit of a partiality of looking at things.
I would say that often it's it depends on the stakeholders, obviously, but for example, in whatever country, Cameroon's Ministry of Environment, they know that first their hands are tied because of other ministries, like I mentioned. They know that their hands are tied because of their presidents. They know that their hands are tied because of international dynamics of power, namely Western and Chinese interests, which are overriding their national priorities, debt, which is taking them in traps. So it's very difficult for someone in a national ministry of environment in a country that's not a prime power to have meaningful ambitions on social ecological transformation, because they're facing a web of structural constraints. Now, if you go higher up in places where you could actually have real discussions and less structural obstacles to have this type of discussions, I would say that something that comes up quite a lot, and that's quite encouraging, is the concept of sobriety, the concept of decoupling of carbon or of energy use and production. So those are actually very much in degrowth type of mindsets. These are things that can be put on the table, but things like questioning property relationships and work relationships, I've honestly never seen that in an official meeting. Maybe the stronger you can get is some type of neo-Keynesian type of policies of putting taxes on the table. But when I try to bring the issue of debt and international financial architecture of power, let's say the Washington Consensus, to go quickly, within North-South dynamics and discussions, or within the African Union Commission, it's people who have the skills and the power to discuss those things and the knowledge often have very direct interest not mentioning those things. So I've never seen a real discussion of how do we reform the IMF within official meetings, personally.
All right, we have two other questions that are both related. For instance, from the chat, Christoph Streisler asked, in your view, related to the example of BCG, in your view, are the leaders of BCG and big firms convinced that there can be a decarbonization of society without putting capitalism in question and their own belief system, or are they just cynics? And Roldan Muradian also has a question related to that, whether the gap that you mentioned among the willingness to accept new ideas among people in different parts of the hierarchical structure of firms has to do with a generational gap, in which case maybe it could leave some place for hope in the future, or with the fact that people that are more open to different ideas are excluded from promotions.
Yeah, thanks. Those are two very good questions. I think on the first one from Christoph, there are cynics. There are people who know and don't care. When I used to be a trader, and you would put on the table the effect on speculation on population from the south who depend on revenue from agricultural exports, then you would have very blunt answers like, I don't care if the world burns, I just want to make money. So I think within private finance, and in particular trading, which is very masculine and very old school in some respects, you have a high presence of cynics who just care about money and about personal gain and so on. But I think in the corporate system, which is very full of greenwashing, in particular at BCG or in the World Economic Forum or things like that, I think you have very few cynics actually, and that's a tiny minority, and the huge majority is actually firmly convinced that they're doing good stuff. Really, I'm 100% convinced that what George Orwell called doublethink is a very, very common phenomenon about within elites. So the ability to look at facts like IPCC reports and to look at what you're doing and not seeing the contradiction, whereas obviously there is one. So you have tons of little excuses that come into play to exonerate your responsibility and to try to evade the responsibility. So I could make a top 10 of the classic excuses, but typically you get, if I don't do it, someone else will do it. Typically you get, you need to be pragmatic. Typically you get, yeah, but it's better now than 10 years ago because now people are aware. So that's encouraging. Typically you get, I'd rather see the glass half full than half empty. You're just a very pessimistic person. Whereas no, it's just realist. It's not about pessimism or optimism. Typically you get stuff like very shallow arguments on technology, genuine faith that there will be a nuclear fusion revolution, or that hydrogen will bring some miracles. But then when people younger like Philipp or myself actually go in detail of the reports of what do those technologies mean, and we come up with an argument saying, no, this doesn't work because ABC, you cannot say that to a high ranking individual in a corporation, BCG or other, because they're so busy. When you get time with them, you can never get into depth. You're trapped by concision, so you can never really shake beliefs, because you would need hours to develop ideas. So it's really difficult to make the people highly ranked change their mindset. Also, I think there's a part of psychological defense mechanism, because for a person who has spent 20, 30 years, not even at BCG, but even at WWF, doing a career based on some axioms and some intellectual references, to now admit that actually what they were believing is wrong, is very much like a self-destruction. I'm not just talking about salary, I'm talking about mental sanity. The person will say, actually, what I believed all these years was wrong, and I may be on the wrong side of history. That's asking the person to commit an ego suicide and a sociological suicide, because then all the circles, all the friends and the relationship of those persons will be obsolete. So I think this cognitive dissonance phenomenon can happen. You can get some 45-year-old director who just say that's enough and quits, but I think that's very, very rare, and we shouldn't rely on that type of elites having an epiphany and realizing what they're doing. Sorry, that was a bit a long remark. But on the second one, for the generation, I think it's both. So you have a generational gap, which is encouraging. I think people are more sensitive now. I think people who were 29 years old in the 1990s were very much in the end of history type of ideology, sexy money, career in finance, corporate raiders, deregulation, the end of risk because of risk manager and the quantification of finance. And you had people 25 years old in 1995 who genuinely dream of having their full career of just being millionaires and making money. And I think now a 29 years old person is very, very different in their mindset, because they've understood that by their living time, or by the time that their children dies, the planet will be fundamentally different. So yes, there is a generational gap. Now, there is also the other thing, the fact that people with different ideas are excluded from promotions, or actually they're not excluded, but they quit, because you don't want to stay all day long within an institution where a few people think like you, but this never comes up in official meetings. So it's not that you get fired because you bring up too often heterodox ideas, is that you cannot handle it anymore, to just be in an environment where you know that what you're doing is full of brainwashing and stuff like that. So you both have the intergenerational phenomena and the institutional filtering phenomena, I would say.
Thank you, Victor, for those detailed reply. Philipp, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, maybe just briefly on what you've said on this, cognitive dissonance. I think that's a very, very strong concept, and well, just from my experience, I can echo that. Like, the higher the professional allegiance to an institution or a concept as well, the higher the resistance to to change your mindset, even though one might discover reasons why this would actually be warranted. And like, this is something that well, I hope being able to say that without being too cynical myself, in the international community of donors, so multilateral development banks, development practitioners, for instance, but also in the entire climate finance space. So basically the official flows of climate finance from industrialized countries to the global south under the Copenhagen pledges, or now also in the future. The more one gets into well, what this actually means, what arrives in the country itself, and how the countries, the governments deal with that, and what actually arrives at the at the target beneficiaries. The higher, let's say, the risk for becoming a cynic, because indeed there are many stories of let's say failure where it just doesn't work, or also many other questions, for instance, the one of overdevelopment. So this is if you talk about that idea of overdevelopment with someone from a development organization like the World Bank, you basically open up a bottomless barrel, it's normally not a good idea, but maybe, as you say, in non-official meetings or at a coffee or a glass of wine, then sometimes one could potentially talk about these ideas, but normally the resistance to them is quite high, I would say.
Well, actually, that's, I think, a perfect assist for the next question, which is how are, generally speaking, environmental issues perceived by those policymakers or stakeholders in businesses? For instance, are they pressing as they perceived as pressing matters, as a hindrance on business as usual, as a public relation opportunity? What have you observed in your experience, Philipp?
Well, I would say a mix of all the three of them. It really depends on the case, and well, I wouldn't say that there is an organization that only has, let's say, or uses, let's say, a climate or a sustainability strategy or narrative for one of these three elements that you mentioned, but it's really a mix of them, and that's what also makes it so difficult to disentangle and to kind of look behind the scenes and kind of assess or evaluate what's actually a transformative proposal.
Victor?
Yeah, I think it really depends on which stakeholder. I think you have very well-informed and willing people to make that a policy priority within governments, even within some institution in the private sector. The problem is more, so environmental issues will be perceived as very important and pressing and urgent, but often the ways to have meaningful implementation of those policies will be very varying depending on the person. So you will have tons of people who get very excited for plastic bans or things like that, which are necessary, but don't really touch to the heart of the problems. Now on the two other hypotheses that you've made, Louison, so the business as usual, or the capacity to hinder business as usual, and the PR opportunity, I think they go hand in hand. So it's like a business leader would perceive that this is a potential threat, but at the same time that this can lead to opportunities. So that's really a golden opportunity for consultancies. For example, if you look at rhetoric from McKinsey or from BCG or from similar or even from big corporations, you will see that they recognize that it's very important to take those issues at heart, because they can really hurt their businesses and because they can really enable new business models. So for example, just on branding and packaging, putting some labels everywhere and putting a bit of healthy and bio and things like that can really allow you to higher up your price points for roughly the same products and so on, and then to get a premium on that. So that's a classic business opportunity. But I think it's very obvious when you look at reports such as the World Economic Forum makes every year a ranking of their priorities as business and government leaders. And what you've seen as dynamic in the 10 last years is that climate change and the 6 mass extinction went from a non-issue to a very high issue. So they're conscious that there is an urgency and that something is happening. Now, the goal for them, I think, and I've had these discussions many times with some of my former colleagues working in BCG think tank or in the World Economic Forum, is that they recognize that they need to be owners of this transformation. They cannot just let governments overrule whatever market decisions or capitalist enterprise or whatever we want to call it, but they need to be in the lead of the transformation. So they will present themselves as global leaders in whatever sector, to be really able to control the rhetoric and the policy. So I think this means you have greenwashing for investors, so all the green finance type of paradigms. You have greenwashing for employees and for recruits on campus, who are told you will have a meaningful career and so on. And obviously you have greenwashing for consumers. And obviously behind the backs, you have all the lobbying and all the production of policy packages and propaganda as we know them.
Thank you guys for your replies. We have a question in the chat by Raymond Caldelus Ilacatala, who asked whether you've seen recognition of ecological economics as in global policy as a field of studies to find answers regarding climate change. And Raymond would like to know whether how degrowth is perceived in the international community. Philipp?
Yeah, I mean, the field of global policy, well, maybe if, let's say, at least from the scientific point of view, for instance, in the latest Working Group 3 report on mitigation from the International Panel on Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we've seen really quite some fundamental changes into the the type of language, the type of studies that were referenced compared to the previous IPCC reports. And indeed, I would say that ecological economics had an increasing influence on the IPCC space, and thereby also for global policy making, because this is what really shapes in the end the decisions that policymakers take. And I can only recommend looking at for instance Timothée Parik's summary on, for instance, how degrowth is featured in the IPCC report, and looking at the more than 2,000 pages plus report itself. It's quite interesting. And then on the how degrowth theory is perceived in the international community. So as I said earlier, let's say at the level of the UNFCCC negotiations, this is a concept that is not being discussed. But for instance, what from this, let's say, Trojan horse perspective, then again would be, let's say, a concept that you can discuss is the idea of absolute decoupling, and the evidence that is out there. And that as many of you probably know, is varies quite a lot, but there is significant evidence that if boundaries are properly defined, and for instance you also take into account the emissions that national companies incur outside of one's territory, that absolute decoupling is a lot more difficult to achieve, and currently not achieved even in countries that normally say they are really at the forefront of decoupling just greenhouse gas emissions from economic growth, not to speak about nature, such as the Nordic countries. So I think degrowth no, but decoupling yes.
Just let add on that here we focus on climate policy, but in fact the issue of decoupling goes beyond greenhouse gases, because it's also about material flows and biodiversity. Exactly. And regarding degrowth in politics, just to add to what you said, it's interesting to see that it starts sometimes to be commented upon by major politicians and also journalists, for instance, and very often not in friendly terms. But that's a sign of increasing audience. And generally speaking, when you are being attacked by prominent figures, it's a good sign. It means you're becoming dangerous. So we could take it as a sign of recognition, even if a negative one. Victor, did you have something to comment on that?
Not much. I strongly agree with what you've both said. I think it's making progress, and I think again it's an active struggle on the words you use. So, for example, maybe degrowth will be heavily criticized, as you said, Louison, which is a good sign, but maybe not so much donut economics or sobriety. Sorry for the French mispronunciation. So yeah, it's really about making them having some place, and sometimes you get The Guardian. So for example, someone an academic publishing something in the Guardian, like, I don't know, Jason Hickel on degrowth or Monbiot and whatever, can really have an impact within policy, because you cannot bring a very academic paper in the table as easily as a Guardian article. So slowly these battles are making progress, but it's difficult and it's quite slow.
Just to reply to a question by Christoph Streisler in the chat. So Philipp referred to a blog post by Timothée Pariq. Pariq, you write it P-A-R-R-I-Q-U-E. And Timothée has a blog on degrowth, and in one of his latest article on that blog, he analyzed how the word degrowth, which, if I recall correctly, appeared 26 times in the last IPCC report, how the degrowth word is used in the report. And something that's interesting in the report, from what I could see, is that the word is not used in a negative way at all. But the report just mentioned that if degrowth is not considered as a policy option, is because no one submitted a scenario including degrowth, because, as you know, the IPCC report is a synthesis of published work. So now maybe a next step for the degrowth community will be to actually produce a scenario of decarbonization. And there are already a couple of papers doing that. For instance, the Lenzen and Kaiser paper from 2021, which does exactly this. So we can hope that more paper will do that, and that in the next IPCC report, those papers will be considered. All right, so maybe we have 4 minutes left, so we will soon wrap up. So to link back to ecological economics and to expanding a bit on the question by Raymond, what is your overall assessment of the reach of ecological economics in the sectors you've been working in, if there is any reach? And do you have any suggestions on how to increase this reach? What would be your take-home message on that front? Victor, you want to start?
Sure, with pleasure. Great questions. I think that the ways that these ideas penetrate actual policymaking and circles of power and so on are not as direct as what can be thought in academia. So typically when you have an IPCC report that states degrowth and then the media takes it and then someone writes an open letter in the Guardian and so on, this makes the ideas penetrate. So it's not like you have an elected politician who will say, now I belong to the field of ecological economics and I will carry on those ideas. It's a bit more of a subtle filtering and active battle. So academics need to be conscious on how these ideas penetrate in outside of academia. So I think there is a growing perception that this is useful. Now, obviously, corporations and other circles of power will fight for the business as usual. So they're also fueling newspapers and policy circles with their versions of the story. So it's really in the end, it's a volume battle. So it's a volume battle not only because good ideas, even in small volume, can make it true. But my suggestion to increase this reach, I would say, is really that I think it's important to recognize that if you don't like the message, you will try to decredibilize the messenger. And for example, in Switzerland, we have Julia Steinberger, who is a part of the IPCC redaction committee, who gets increasingly media appearances, but also people criticizing her, or people criticizing the IPCC, or people criticizing the UN or governments, or science as a general concept. And what the pandemic did in terms of political response and all the septic movements also is not helping science as a set of institutions and as methodologies to have good acceptation in the society. So what I would say as a tip for academics is to recognize that science is also part of political frameworks and of actual day-to-day struggles and of the mainstream world of media, of political beliefs, of political opinions and public opinion, and to get active within that, not to think that just because the paper is very well written or has some quotes in the scientific world that it will make it true. So in summary, maybe the academia should really be involved actively in politics, and I know that's a big debate, but I think it should. And if the academia and science doesn't take care of politics, the other way around will happen. Politics will take care of science and try to silence it. So it's tricky.
Yeah, we already seeing that in many countries, unfortunately. Thank you very much, Victor. Philipp, would you like to comment on that, and then we will conclude?
Yeah, just briefly, so I can fully echo what you've said, Victor, and maybe just one more thing. So what I think what is really key is this, transmission of knowledge from from research communities to policymakers and also to businesses. And so really improving the scientific communication and knowing the audience that one is talking to, and maybe also, anticipating a bit their, apprehensions or fears of and their reactions to what one would actually present, and not, and not adopting, let's say, this confrontation only, but really like engaging in a dialogue. And then one last thing that I think what could be important to increase the reach of ecological economics is, well, first of all, increasing the community of ecological economics through education and holding networks together, and then really placing these people letting them choose to be placed in relevant positions, and thereby disseminating these ideas.
All right, thanks a lot, Victor and Philipp, for all those super interesting answers, remarks, and insights. So thanks a lot again for being with us today. Thanks to everyone who attended the seminar. The seminar can be viewed afterwards on YouTube, so don't hesitate to disseminate the link, and stay tuned for the next episodes of the webinar series, which will come very soon. See you soon, everyone, and thanks a lot again.